Okay, so here we go. Week 3, doing food resources. So first we have to talk about terrestrial versus aquatic food production system. Terrestrial means land. So land versus water food production system. Alright, so first with aquatic food production, the food's harvested from high trophic levels, large top consumers, so example, the salmon. And then your photosynthesis is less efficient by producers due to light reflection of the water. So something like the plankton, the phytoplankton, would do photosynthesis. It's not as efficient because of light reflecting off the water, but they do it, and then they're eaten by the krill, which gets eaten by the herring, and we catch the herring. The herring can be eaten by the bass, and we catch the bass, like we go and catch the larger things. For the terrestrial food, most of it is harvested from the low trophic levels. We're actually taking the producers and the herbivores, and as opposed to like the top of the food chain. So like you have your solar radiation, so you're getting the photosynthesis and all the plants, which are then being eaten by the herbivores, and we're collecting the plants and the herbivores, and then using that to create our food. Okay, in our process, we are affecting the environment through our means of food production. You affect the biodiversity of an area. So bio is life and diversity is diverse. Like there's a lot of things, but and the way like traditional land farming was, you had your individual family home and you kind of basically grew some of everything, so you had everything that you need. Now, like all the farms are largely like one crop. That's why we drive around and there's just field after field after field of corn. And that's it, because people are doing this mass production to accommodate how our world is working these days, versus your traditional like family farm with all of the different stuff actually was better and more stable and required less chemicals to be able to make it work. So what I mean by that, when you're doing one single type of crop, you're more likely to encounter diseases. You know, you find something that attacks that one thing, that one plant, and now your whole crop is wiped out, or some disease, whatever, or it's just a bad year for the corn, but other stuff did really well. The soil doesn't have a lot of nutrients left into it, so you're having to use lots of chemical fertilizers, versus your traditional family farm that did everything. They would have a variety of different crops, but they also would rotate their crops. So like you picture, you know, you got this like big field and maybe you quarter it and divide it into 4 sections. So one section would be empty for a year. One section would have something like clover, one section could have corn, one section could have something else. The next year, just rotate it all like 90 degrees clockwise. So each thing moves over to another quadrant. And by doing that, the empty spot's giving the soil a chance to rest. The clover is injecting nitrogen, which is important. That's what's in like a lot of your fertilizers, into the soil, making that a more rich spot, you know, and so on. So it's not becoming some tired old spot that requires you to use a lot of chemicals. It just takes care of itself naturally. So that's some of the stuff we're going to see in this food production, how it affects soil, water, and air. We've talked about it with the water resources, that irrigation kind of actually can create issues because it changes the runoff pattern. And we also talked about how like the trees stabilize the soil, so by removing them all to clear these huge tracts of land to just grow a bunch of corn means that you're more likely to experience unstable dirt and soil. So it's able to be blown away in the wind, it's able to be run off with the water, and so forth. So that's kind of what happened like during the Dust Bowl. Everything was so dry and there was nothing to keep the soil stable. And then you know, with the runoff on that, when you're using a bunch of chemicals, that's being carried away with the water, and then it's into the streams, and it affects all the wildlife in the streams that live there. It affects all the wildlife that drink out of it, everything. And then even the stuff you're spraying on the plants, like it injures the insects that are there to pollinate it. That's why the bees are dying. So, and then as you go through, you know, this plant grew with that chemical, this animal ate that plant, you ate that animal, and so they're coming and getting into your system as well, all these chemicals. So that's kind of the thing we're talking about with this unit. Alright, so in that, like I said, we have a biodiversity loss. We lose the grassland forests and the wetlands for cultivation. You can see this beautiful field that has all sorts of different plants in it then becomes this field of wheat. Nothing there. It's gone. Yeah, so we lose that genetic diversity, we lose the wild crops, and you just have single crops. That's what monocrops is. The erosion then is increased. The soil is less fertile. You get an increased amount of salt, the salinization of the soil. You get a lot more salt gets left behind. You get desertification, where it's just all dried out like a desert, and an increase in soil pH, and that's not an ideal place for plants to grow. You lose a lot of life that way. Alright, as far as the water, we end up with wastewater being produced. So that's water that's got waste in it. It's not just clean, pure water, and that's what's all over the place. Our aquifer depletion from increased irrigation. So aquifers is just where water exists naturally. You know, normally your water table is up a little bit higher, but then now it's way down low, so the well doesn't have as much water in it. All that because of how we've changed the whole circumstance through irrigation, or we've hurt the water by allowing chemicals into it from the runoff. We have a lot of fossil fuel use in the farming equipment, releasing your greenhouse gases, the CO2, the nitrogen, and so that stuff's all being released into the air. But more than that, you also have the pesticide sprays, and while they are affecting the water from like rain washing it off the plants, it is also still in the air, and that's still bad. And then for our human health, we end up with things like nitrates into our drinking water. Nitrates are bad for you. It's so that blue baby is like that because it's affecting the amount of oxygen in that baby's system, and that's why the baby looks blue. You know, the pesticides are carcinogens and can cause cancers. They're bad for us. We end up with bacterial contamination in our meat because of how we farm. You'll see that, you know, like the cows are in these confined spaces. There's turds everywhere. They're walking through it. And so then they're sick. And then that's what then gets processed and sent to us. And we have E. coli in the meat. That's why you see all those recalls all the time. Or listeria or whatever, and it's in things as simple as, you know, a bag of peas or spinach. And this is the kind of water that could come out of a well from the runoff. Alright, so yeah, we have the industrial farming that changed the practices. This is all one thing, as opposed to when it was a single family farm, they had sections of all sorts of different kinds of crops and could sustain themselves entirely. So our North American cereal farming, so that's your oats, your wheat, your corn, they have to add fertilizers, pesticides, fossil fuels, labor, sunlight, and water equipment to help make things grow. The characteristics of our farming system is to have heavy use of fossil fuels, lots of farming technology, and monocrops, so each place only does one crop. And then So like around here, corn grows really well, so we have lots of people growing corn around here that contribute. A lot of these big huge farms, corn farms around here are contributing and taking their corn to where it needs to go for our cereal farming. Then, other places are more conducive to do wheat, so they're doing wheat there, and so on and so forth. Because of the way our culture is, we're kind of like, we want stuff here now, ready to go. So we have fast production in large amounts, but we end up with lots of waste. We're not working effectively. And so with that, it creates a loss of biodiversity, air pollution, water pollution, but it creates large quantities of wheat and corn and lots of income for people. Alright, so there's a thing called subsistence farming. So it's kind of like a slash and burn, like cut things down and burn it off and then start cultivating it. This is how they do it in Asia, and it's a lot of human labor, water, and sunlight. They grow only enough for them to eat and use little technology. Usually it's more in poor areas, but it maintains the biodiversity and reduces the pollution. And they get mixed crops, like all in the same field. Here's 3 different crops that would come out of the same field. Then if you've had a home garden, you can do a lot of different crops in a small space. You might have a patch of garden, but you've got peppers and beans and tomatoes and squash and zucchini and whatever, all in one spot, and it sustains you and you have plenty. That's the way it used to be on regular farms. Alright, so the Maasai tribal livestock, they use labor and cattle feed and grass grazing. They have large herds of cattle that are being used only as a food source, but it's like they do nomadic herding, so they're kind of still moving around with their herd. Here, though, the cattle is the source of life, and it's even used as currency. But their problem with it is that there's overgrazing and that nomadic behavior where they're just moving around with their herd, but they're getting their milk and meat sources out of it. Alright, so this is some salmon farming. When we have salmon just in nature and in the river, they go and follow their normal routes and patterns. And when we do farming, it's different. I know we just saw some of that with Light Damnation and these recent videos. We'll talk about it a little bit more in our next video. Come back, we'll start here.